So good morning, dear guests here in the Turku City Theatre and also people watching this web stream. Warm welcome to this panel discussion where we focus on German foreign policy and the approaching federal elections in this September. This event is organized jointly with the German Embassy in Helsinki and the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. My name is Juha Jokela and I work as the program director of our EU research program at the Finnish Institute. Before turning to our excellent panelists, maybe a few words on the theme and how we aim to proceed here today. I think that the importance of German elections for Europe, for the EU and Finland is rather obvious. Germany is the largest EU member state and the federal government in Berlin is a key player in European foreign policy with a notable global reach as well. During Angela Merkel's 16 years in power, Germany has played a major role in tackling several European crises. Many of these crises have originated outside Europe and the EU. While Germany's influence in external economic relations is widely recognized and felt in Europe and the world, there's quite a significant expectations that Germany would take more responsibility also in diplomacy and military matters. Especially, I would say, in the post-Brexit Europe. So in this panel, we aim to discuss the key foreign and security policy challenges of Germany and the EU in an increasingly turbulent European neighborhood and the world. And I think there is no shortage of big topics. We can discuss the relations with Russia, with China, developments in transatlantic relations, especially now in the aftermath of rather chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. We've heard that Germany has very strong views on multilateralism, also rules-based order, how to work towards that. And importantly, what are the Germany's views on how to make EU foreign policy more effective? And I think these elections now, when Chancellor Merkel is stepping down, are particularly important, but also particularly interesting, as the outcome of the elections is far from certain. So we are very eager to learn more about the priorities of different key German political actors, the parties, and the election campaigns as well, and hear about analysis on how the elections might impact on Germany's position in the world and in the EU. So we will start our panel with opening interventions from our distinguished panelists, and then we proceed with questions and answers. The audience here at the theatre will have a possibility to provide comments and questions, and the viewers can post also their questions via the chat function of the online platform. So let me now briefly introduce our first panelist to you, and we are very delighted to have Dr. Rachel Tausenfront here with us today. You have taken the time and traveled from Berlin to Turku via Helsinki, and we are very, very happy about that. You work as the editorial director at the German Marshall Fund, and before joining the fund, you have worked in the European Council on Foreign Relations and German Council on Foreign Relations as well. And your field of expertise covers German, American, and transatlantic politics, as well as international trade policy and European foreign policy. And we are very eager to hear your analysis and your assessments about the German elections and their implications for Germany's foreign policy. Rachel, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to Turku. It's my first time here. And thank you also for giving me a doctor title that I did not complete in real life. So I'm happy to take it, but sadly. It's not true. Thank you also very much for the German embassy. I think it's especially kind that the Germans invited me, an American who's a kind of honorary Berliner, having lived there for 20 years, to talk about the German elections. I have a sort of outsider-insider perspective, since I will not actually be voting in the election, but I'm watching the field very closely and have been in foreign policy in Berlin for a while. So, as you say, this is an interesting election because for the first time in 16 years, Angela Merkel is not going to be chancellor at the end of this election. And not only that, it's entirely possible that her party candidate member, Armin Laschet, is also not going to be chancellor. So we're not going to have Angela Merkel, and we might also not have a Christian Democrat chancellor. So that alone makes it a little bit interesting. And we've seen really interesting sort of movements in the positions of the parties in the past year. So to say where we are right now, as of yesterday, a new poll came out from Kantar, and we have the Armin Laschet and the CDU. So this is, for those of you who watch Germany closely, you'll know that the Christian Democrats and the Christian Socialists form a union. For the sake of clarity, I'm just going to call them the Christian Democrats for this conversation, so apologies to everyone in Bavaria. The CDU is at 23% with their chancellor candidate, Armin Laschet. And the Social Democrats and their chancellor candidate, Olaf Scholz, are at also 23%. And this is new. This is a very recent development. And third, we have the Greens at 18% with their candidate, Annalena Baerbock. So I'll tell you right now, I cannot tell you who's going to win, but I would say we have an open race between those three parties at this point. And that's also the first time since 2005 that we've had this open of a race 1 month out from the election. It's a month from yesterday, I believe. So that means we're not sure really exactly what to expect. Third, or actually fourth, is the Liberals, the Free Democratic Party, and they are polling at 12%. They are not important in terms of the chancellor race, but they will be very important, it looks like, in terms of forming a coalition. So they probably will take their traditional role of kingmaker and being the third important piece of a coalition. Going by today's numbers, that said, we've seen pretty big fluctuation. But from today's numbers, it looks like FDP will be important. Finally, we have Die Linke, the left-wing party of Germany. They're polling at 7%. I won't talk about them much because they're not that important in the coalition discussions. But if anyone has a question, that's fine. And finally, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is Germany's right-wing, sort of anti-EU, ethno-nationalist party. They're polling at 11%, which is down a bit from 2017. And they certainly won't be part of any coalition. The other parties have ruled that out. So they're also not interesting for this conversation, I would say. So what can we expect from these three parties? I'll start with the Christian Democrats, the CDU. What we can expect from them is not big change. I would say they are campaigning on a platform of stability, continuity, no experiments is a bit the joke about their campaign this time. The fact that Armin Laschet is the chancellor candidate is itself the choice to not choose a direction. There was a competition in the leadership between a more conservative, Friedrich Merz, fiscally conservative, socially conservative candidate, or somebody like Norbert Röttgen, who is a more kind of engaged foreign policy, globalist, modern Christian Democrat. And both of those didn't win. They went with Armin Laschet, who not that many people are excited about, but he's sort of solidly none of the above. So the CDU, solidly transatlantic. They have come out in support of higher military spending, fulfilling the 2% spending goals, but otherwise kind of more of the same. Now tied currently with the Christian Democrats, you have the Social Democrats, SPD, and Olaf Scholz. The Social Democrats are traditionally a little bit less transatlantic. They are not supporting higher defense or military spending. They're a bit more European in their kind of outlook and framing of the issues. Sometimes they're less fiscally conservative. That said, Olaf Scholz is one of the more fiscally conservative members of, he sort of represents the fiscally conservative wing of the Social Democrats. And don't forget, the Social Democrats have been in 3 of the last 4 governments. So there's actually also a lot of continuity in an SPD, especially led by Olaf Scholz. And they're at the moment quite united around Olaf Scholz. Interestingly, probably from a Finnish perspective, in addition to the fiscal issues, is where the SPD is on China and Russia. Traditionally, the SPD has been, we call them the bear hugger party sometimes. They've been a little close to Russia. They've had a hard time drawing sort of, strict lines against, Russian intrusions and problems. But today's SPD is not Gerhard Schröder's SPD. It's not the SPD of 10 years ago, in part because of Russian actions since Ukraine. I mean, with the Navalny poisoning, he came to Germany, was treated in Germany. Public opinion has shifted quite a bit. So today's SPD is softer on Russia than probably the Greens or the CDU, but I wouldn't say they're worryingly soft on Russia. Similar China, the SPD would like to sort of stay friends with China and avoid a confrontation, but they are increasingly also willing to acknowledge that there's some kind of competition there. So a lot of continuity, slightly softer in some of the edges and more European. That leads us to the Greens with Annalena Baerbock. Now, the Greens and Annalena Baerbock are very much positioning themselves as a transformative party. They want a different kind of Germany. They also haven't been in the government in the last 16 years, so it is a different. It's a more sort of confident activist, obviously Green Party, so very engaged on climate issues. But in terms of foreign policy, they're very much along the lines of the Biden administration's idea of this liberal democratic competition with authoritarian powers. They're very strong on, human rights and mention rights and things like that. So the Greens are positioning themselves to have a kind of new energy. They're also very European. They always talk about wanting Germany to be part of an EU foreign policy that's much stronger and more activist. So I think they're the most engaged in terms of really strengthening European capabilities in foreign policy. They would also be less fiscally conservative, would be my guess, depending on who they're governing with, in terms of EU spending and EU budgets. So those are the big 3. The Liberals, as I said, are important in terms of coalition, and they're interesting in their foreign policy. In this kind of authoritarian competition, they're very much aligned with the Greens or have a similar rhetoric. Very activist in terms of human rights, in terms of standing up to authoritarian governments, but they're less pro-EU. They certainly would not be in favor of bigger EU budgets or more German spending toward the EU. So they're a mixed picture, but they would be a very junior member of the coalition. I guess I would have 2 conclusions for this election. One is, if the CDU is the major partner, I wouldn't expect a lot of change, at least not in this first term. If the Greens were the leading partner or are a major partner without the CDU, then there could be some shifts in German foreign policy and German policy towards the EU. So I can't tell you which of these things is going to happen, but that's where I would leave it in terms of what to watch for and what one could expect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel, for this very analytical overview of the positions and also the potential questions emerging, what the election outcome might bring us. I think we will get get back to many of the questions you raised, also the transatlantic relations, China-Russia relations, and so forth. But now I would like to give the floor to our second panelist, who is Anna-Liina Kauhanen from Helsingin Sanomat. You are the editorial writer in Helsingin Sanomat, and you've been also a correspondent of Helsingin Sanomat in Berlin and Stockholm.
Yes.
And currently you're following very closely security policy developments in Europe and beyond. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. And we just heard Finnish Prime Minister Sanna Marin talking here in the Turku Eurooppa-foorumi. And after her spoke the main opposition leader, Conservative Party Kokoomus leader Petteri Orpo. And they actually summarized the Finnish expectations for Germany. It's very highly understood and shared that the German election is very crucial for whole Europe. We heard just Petteri Orpo putting to the same sentence Brexit and the end of the era of Merkel. So that's signalizing us the importance of that election for whole Europe and for whole Finland. And today's Prime Minister has now spoken 3 times in a week, something EU-related. And she is still very careful. She's saying exactly the right thing, but even if she already has some experience in the hard EU table negotiations, she's very careful to open her own personal views or expectations what's happening in Europe. But anyway, Finland share quite much the analysis that Europe must be more independent from the US. And Afghanistan now frames the whole EU debate about foreign policy and defense politics, and it's also so here in Finland. President Sauli Niinistö, he's very active in European defense issues, and actually you can say and simplify that the only policy area where Finland really wants to see some more integration in the European Union is defense politics. So during these days, one of the key words is the European battle groups, and where are they and how should we use them. So that's very big issue now, that how Germany position itself in defense questions in the future. Petteri Orpo, the Conservative Party leader, he's in kind of an interesting role. Kokoomus is one of the biggest EU parties in Finland, and at the same time they are the biggest opposition party, and that we also hear when he's speaking. He's very much underlying the Finnish national interest in the EU politics, and that's now the zeitgeist in Finland, that there's a process where we try to be more, at the same time, more independent and more progressive in the EU politics. There's an interesting development in Europe right now, that it might be so that actually Germany is turning to the other way than Finnish domestic politics in EU issues right now. We'll see that in the political field in Europe, the dividing line is no more going in the left and right. It's more like the line is between middle and the radical right. So we see here in Finland that conservatives are a little bit like building up a coalition with the Finns party. And that might be something totally new in Finnish when thinking about Finnish EU politics. And I could imagine that because the German-Finnish relationship is not only one-way politics, so it can be so that, for instance, for Chancellor Anna-Lena Baerbock, it might be quite different Finland to be a partner when we have a Finnish party prime minister or coalition with the conservatives and the right, extreme right party. But the same we might see in Sweden. So there's actually the Scandinavian politics is having a little bit its own political life right now. And but generally speaking, Germany, the business and the political and the leaders, we all understand the importance of the Germany, and there's almost a fantasy that what German could do for Europe. So we all gonna miss Merkel, and unfortunately it's so that there's 3 very potential candidates to be the next chancellor, but no one of them actually is the Finnish, like the ideal chancellor. We want a iron lady or a strong guy who really can confront aggressive Russia and being like the leader to follow. But that's of course everybody's having so much expectation what Germany could give us other Europeans. But actually in the Finnish debate we are really much sharing the German values and the multilateralism, and we don't expect that the German EU politics would change a lot. But there's no revolution, but there's absolutely going to be evolution in the how Germany is looking Russia and China, and that's also very important to Finland. And when looking the Finnish debate, we do frame exactly the same way the candidates than you, Rachel, just did. So Armin Laschet is more the same. Anna-Lena Baerbock, the Green candidate, yes, she might be hardliner with Russia and China, and that's interesting, but what does it in real politics really mean? We don't know. She doesn't know. And Olaf Scholz, when I was working in Germany, the SPD was just so in deep crisis that it's for me, it's personally very surprising that he is now one of the main candidates to be the next chancellor. So in short time, it really can happen a lot in the European politics right now, and that we must remember. But maybe this is my opening for this interesting debate.
Thank you very much, Anna-Lena, for bringing in the Finnish political landscape and as well as this comparison between Germany and Finland. I think this is very, very healthy and interesting and part of our aim here today. To discuss that. But now I would like to turn to our third speaker, who is Niklas Hellwig, leading researcher in the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. You've been following German politics, German foreign policy for a number of years and published quite widely on the topic. But you've been also recently focused very much on the strategic autonomy, the EU's aspiration or the debate about the strategic autonomy, also beyond the sort of security defense strategic autonomy expanding to economic external relations, as well as the current geoeconomic landscape. So what are your views on the German elections, Niklas? Please,
thank you
the floor
so
is
much.
yours.
Thank you. And to add to this biography, I'm also German. So
Yeah, just wait a second. I think.
Am I back now? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry about that start. So yeah, what I wanted to say is that I'm also German. So I don't know exactly about you, Rachel, but I might be actually the only one or one of the few on the panel who is actually allowed to vote in the German elections. And to add to your point, Rachel, that you said that it's now the race is quite open. My personal experience is that I myself actually don't yet know whom I'm gonna be voting for, because I think it is really an interesting phase of German politics. And I would say what we can see there is a little bit the Finlandization of the German political landscape. You know, when you watch parliament elections in Finland, there is actually always a tight race going on between some parties that are around 20%, and you don't know ahead of the election evening who's going to come out on top, what are the possible coalitions that can form in the end. And that is what we see in Germany, and that is quite interesting. But it also has consequences, of course, on the immediate capability of Germany in the maybe next year or maybe longer to fulfill this leadership role that the two of you talked about already in Europe. And I think that is really crucial from a Nordic perspective. You already explained how important Germany is for the Nordic countries, and I just want to underline this. I think really what the Nordic countries and Finland have to worry about is German inaction in kind of bringing EU member states together and shaping European politics. And that is because of two reasons. Because first, Germany traditionally, and there's a lot of research on it, in its European policies and foreign policy, it tries to be a very inclusive leader. It tries to bring in the views of the countries on the margins of Europe. It tries to be an advocate for the smaller member states, tries to give them a voice opportunity. And this kind of feature is, of course, very important for a smaller member state like Finland. Second, I think Germany is very important for Finland because there's a lot of overlap when it comes to policy positions. When it comes to foreign policy issues, the transatlantic focus of both countries is quite strong. And especially when it comes to economic issues, of course, there's a similar outlook when it comes to fiscal European matters, when it comes to European industrial policy. So there's a lot of overlap, and that has become even more important. And you mentioned that now that the UK left the EU, and there are not so many countries or big countries left that share this Nordic perspective on strong single market competition and strong transatlantic relations. So that makes the German elections even more important. And I also think that now it's an interesting time to watch German elections, because many of the big strategic choices of Germany haven't been fully answered in these 16 years of Merkel government. Many of the foreign policies, the big strategic choices. So undoubtedly, Merkel was really good in managing a lot of the crises that we've seen in recent years, a refugee crisis, Euro crisis, the whole Ukraine crisis. And she was this architect of many compromises and deals. Think about the Turkey deal, for example. But we have an article coming out with a colleague of mine, Thomas Isomakko, in the next issue of Ulkopolitiken magazine, the magazine that FIA brings out. And there we argue that yes, she was good. Merkel was good in stopping crisis, bringing member states together, form a compromise, but at the cost of formulating the bigger strategic visions and to kind of find a longer outlook, for example, on Russia, for example, how to deal with China, and also on other policy issues, or how to deal with the refugee situation and the migration issues. And one area where I want to highlight this in my remaining minutes is this question of European strategic autonomy, which is really at the center of the discussion on EU level. So the question, how can Europe find an answer to this increasing competition that we see internationally, the demise of multilateralism, the competition between China and the US, and this rapid technological transformation. How can we keep European sovereignty? And there are different answers in Europe to that. On the one hand, you have member states like France, who are very much pushing this concept of European strategic autonomy, and their solutions focus more on a strong interventionist policy, state interventionist policy when it comes to industrial policy, for example. They are less concerned of making compromises to the transatlantic relationship than maybe some other member states. So they are on the one hand of the extreme where you see favor for restrictive policies, interventionist policies, and a strong European focus. And then you have other countries, let's take, for example, the Baltic countries, who also say, yes, we want to have a strong European voice, but they find other answers to that. They say that it should be with a strong transatlantic relationship. It shouldn't be about state interventionism when it comes to the single market, but having a deeper single market, for example, on digital issues, to complete the single market, to increase competition. And so they have a completely, different approach to that. And Germany, it seems to me, is on some policy issues on the one side, they are, for example, when it comes to defense cooperation, they are closely working together with France on defense industrial projects. On some other issues, they are more siding with Baltic countries. For example, there was the joint letter by the Finnish, Estonian and Danish and German Prime Minister and Chancellor on deepening the digital single market. So there you see more like a Nordic club where they are engaged and bring forward the ideas. So it is not quite clear yet how the German position on European strategic autonomy will develop looking forward. But I think for a country like Finland, I think there are a lot of overlaps. As I mentioned, the transatlantic devotion, this idea of a competitive single market that also gives small and medium enterprises chances, and not only like the big industrial players like that are centered around maybe Germany and France. And so there is an opportunity for the Finnish government and for Finnish policy apparatus in general and Nordic policy apparatus to try to influence the next German government, because there are many kind of links where they see eye to eye and where they have same visions on European strategic autonomy and this broader role of Europe in the world and how to engage in international competition.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Niklas. And this debate on strategic autonomy is certainly highly topical. I think the Prime Minister who spoke here today has, on those 3 speeches, have now mentioned it several times. And I think this debate is really kicking on a gearing speed here in Finland as well. Now I think it's time to move to our discussion session, and I would also ask the audience to ask comments, to provide comments and ask questions. Please raise your hand if you have already one in your mind, and then I can come back to you soon. But I would like to pick up 2 themes in the very beginning, and one relates also to the kind of experience of the previous election. I remember that Chancellor Merkel said to her fellow Christian Democrats before the elections that these would be the most difficult elections she fought. And then, of course, we saw that there was a more fragmented political landscape in Germany, and it took almost 6 months to form a coalition government. One attempt failed. So how do you see it this time? Now, of course, the race is still open, but whether we will see a new government within a shorter time, and also how strong that government might be. Of course, we don't know the election results yet, but kind of what is known now. So maybe you start with Rachel.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, according to the current math, it looks like it's going to be complicated coalition negotiations, probably involving 3 parties. And as soon as that happens, it gets complicated, depending on if there's a clear leader. I mean, if 1 year ago it looked certain that the CDU was going to be 10, 15 points above everyone else, and then it was just a matter of kind of how strong the Greens were going to be in this coalition. I mean, that was sort of the unspoken consensus, and now indeed one doesn't know. I expect, I mean, if you imagine, for example, the CDU and the SPD come in very close, like it is now, then you would have, let's say the CDU is 2 points ahead. You would have a situation where you could have, they would be in the lead, they would want to form a coalition with the Greens and the Liberals, let's just say. But it might be in the Greens' interest to not be the left-wing person in a conservative government, and the math might work out that the Greens could be eyeing a coalition with the SPD and the Liberals. So that's a long way of saying, yeah, indeed, it might be a mess, and it might take a number of months. And either way, certainly if you look at the CDU, I mean, I said it's consistency, sort of stability, but weaker. I mean, Laschet is already not a very popular leader in the CDU, and he's not even leading yet. So he's certainly going to be a weaker chancellor in his party. The party is going to be weaker in the coalition. So it's going to be messier, at least initially, and possibly for the entire term, in terms of not having a space to have real leadership in some of the important areas where the partners, including the United States and certainly the European partners, might want answers. You might have a Germany that's just too focused on kind of negotiations between parties to really show any kind of leadership possible.
Anna-Lena, do you think this is understood here in Finland with your interlocutors in discussions?
Well, it's a problem for all the others in Europe that we need to weigh Germany, because we are in the middle of the next crisis already when thinking about Afghanistan, and when observing how worried the European leaders are now if we are facing the next refugee crisis. And then, of course, Russia and China probably would test the new Germany after Merkel, what's happening. But actually it's not enough that we wait that Germany is having the new government. We also need to wait France, because there's an election next year, and what's crucial to the rest of the Europe is how do the new leaders find each other. So that's actually, when thinking about the strategic autonomy of Europe, then France and Germany must play together. And if it's Emmanuel Macron, Michel Barnier, or Marine Le Pen, or thinking about those 3 candidates, it's like very much 3-dimensional chess what they are playing together. Where's the engine of the European project? That we'll see in a year probably. But yes, turbulent times ahead.
Niklas, do you think there is more possibilities for having this strategic view on those big questions after the elections than there were during Merkel era?
Well, I'm not so sure, and that's not because there's always a lot of focus on the candidates, and they talk about Armin Laschet not being a strong leadership figure, or Olaf Scholz having been around for too long and following many of the policies. But I think it's really this new party landscape and this new need to form this multi-party coalitions, which Finland is not, which Germany is not used to, that will limit Germany's ability for leadership on these strategic questions in the coming, maybe coming years. I think when it comes to, you ask about the coalition negotiations, and it could go actually rather quickly if the CDU comes out on top and they would attempt a kind of Jamaica coalition. They have already experiences from that from the last time. Okay, it failed, but it didn't really fail the last time because there were many substantive policy differences, but it was rather a tactical move by the Liberal Party to kind of opt out last minute from these negotiations. Otherwise, when you look at the party programs, there's enough overlap to have a stable, or to come to an agreement. But then it will take some time just for the new government to establish the same position within the international fora. When you look at how closely Merkel operated together with Putin, how closely she worked with the US counterparts. Of course, there's the whole German machinery and the ministry, of course, behind it, behind the government efforts and ministers' efforts. But still, there will be a learning curve, and there will be a need sometimes to do more compromises within a bigger coalition government.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much. I think I saw already at least one question from the audience. Now I ask if there are any others already at this stage. Maybe we take now the question from the lady behind, and the microphone is over here.
Okay, thank you so much for your interesting talks already. I think this week Angela Merkel announced that Germany will not be needing Russian gas by 2045, and Ukraine should be prepared for this. So how do you see, the kind of idea that I've been getting from your speeches and from other sources is that Germany is losing patience with Russia in many respects, and irrespective of the name of the new chancellor. So how do you see the sanctions policy developing? Is there some clear tendencies between the, let's say, the three main candidates? And what should I'm representing Finnish firms that work on the Russian market. Sorry, I didn't say that. From the East Office of Finnish Industry. So how do you see, what kind of risks should we be prepared for in relation to German sanctions policy on Russia, or policy on Russia, the human rights mechanism that the EU has been developing, and these kind of risks? Thank you.
Thank you. Could you also state your name?
Sinikka Parviainen.
Thank you very much.
Should I?
Let's start with Niklas this time. So,
all right,
Russia and
yeah. So when you look at the party manifestos and the speeches of the candidates and how it looks like, what are the possible government constellations, I don't think there will be a massive change in the German approach towards EU sanction policy towards Russia. I think the main principles that had been agreed on already in the aftermath, direct aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, that you need to see further steps on the ground until you can ease sanctions towards Russia. I think that is kind of consensus within the EU, and it's consensus within the German party landscape. So with relation to Nord Stream 2, I think that is a bit of a separate issue from the sanctions policy. Nord Stream 2 is seen as by now as a reality in Germany. I don't think there is any realistic chance that they would put a stop to that project or put a moratorium on putting it into action unless we see any really major policy development vis-à-vis Russia or with Russia, some kind of action by Russia that would provoke that. But it's seen by many of the foreign policy experts in Germany not as an effective way also to punish Russia for actions. Not as an effective sanctions instrument, because it's not directly linked to, for example, human rights abuses, poisoning of Navalny, imprisonment of Navalny, and so it's not seen as maybe the most effective way to address some of the difficulties you see. So I don't expect major changes. There are, of course, the opportunities within the EU sanctions framework on humanitarian, especially on humanitarian issues or human rights, to impose further sanctions on the Russian government. But without any major changes in or international events, I don't see big changes. I don't know how you perceive that, Rachel.
Yeah, my analysis would be similar. I think, the Nord Stream, it was still in the Green Party platform to stop Nord Stream. Merkel and Biden did a future potential CDU and Green coalition a big favor in negotiating it. Now no one's going to make an issue of stopping it. So Nord Stream is I would also separate that. It's basically done at this point, and even the Greens who think it's a terrible idea are not going to probably make an issue of it. Sanctions are slightly different. I mean, there are powerful business interests in Germany as well when it comes to Russia, and a lot of them are gas related, and this is why we have the issue we have with Nord Stream. So that will continue to be an issue. I think on sanctions, I would not expect any of the parties, even the SPD, to be interested in weakening them unless Russia changes, which frankly I really don't expect. If Russia continues to provoke, Western powers doing more hacking, election disruption activities, and poisoning or whatever, I could imagine more sanctions. Certainly the Biden administration will do a better job of working with Germans and other Europeans to increase sanctions. So that's a possibility, especially if the Greens are involved. But I would separate that from some of the gas and oil issues.
Well, we just saw Chancellor Merkel visiting Moscow after her visit in Washington. And so it's much about the US-Russian politics to have the dialogue. When they Merkel and Biden made the deal on Nord Stream 2, so there was a need to explain that to Russia too. So the own Russia politics is so existential thing to Finland that actually there's not that much trust to the common European Russian politics. It doesn't exist right now, but the German Russian politics and Merkel has been very important to Finland, Finnish foreign politics, especially the sanction politics. And of course, Finland would like to see the very much supportive common Russian politics, but I think that Finland always thinks that we still have our own Russian politics, and dialogue is very important part of that. And now we see that also Biden thinks so. So it's the European-Russian relationship would definitely change after Merkel, but how? That is a big question to Finland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. Biden administration was mentioned several times also when we were discussing Russia, and of course your opening remarks already noted the Afghanistan situation and the implications. Of course, it's a crisis what is now taking place, but then of course there is the aftermath of it, and of course during the early months of Biden administration, this kind of European transatlantic bond has been spoken and acted upon very vividly in Berlin, and now of course there might be some discussion that how strong this link is, and especially whether there is a need for European capabilities, especially also in the field of security and defense policy, the European pillar of NATO, or then the EU defense policy developments. So how do you see this? Of course, it's now discussed in the election debates, but when the new government take over and when the kind of the the developments involve, does this leave a kind of a mark to the transatlantic relations? I mean, the Afghanistan withdrawal, and what kind of lessons learned discussions we might see in Berlin?
Yeah, I do actually think that this is an important shift happening in German foreign policy. So for the last 10 years at least, there have been these conversations about Germany taking on more responsibility in the world. And I think, especially if you look at people working in and entering positions of more power in government who are around my age, which would be around Annalena Baerbock's age, this isn't a kind of academic discussion anymore. It's felt, and it's felt pretty strongly, I would say, maybe most strongly in sort of CDU circles and in Green circles. And if you think about, Afghanistan, first of all, the 20-year war there, and now the recent developments, Syria, the Trump election. I mean, these are formative things for the German foreign policy community and people who are, 40 instead of 60. And so I think there is genuine energy and interest in a sort of more active German foreign policy. Now you have, depending on the party, those who are more focused on NATO and transatlantic. And if you go in the direction of the Greens, those who see it more in a sort of European or multilateral context. But I do think maybe not, it depends. Maybe not initially right after this election, but medium term, this is definitely happening, I think, in German foreign policy. You might even say this is part of the shift towards the Greens. I mean, 2017, the Greens got, I think, 9% of the vote, and now they're around 20. And I think it might be a bigger German sense of urgency of changing the world, of having more of an impact, whereas former generations in Germany were a little happy to be letting those decisions be made by others and kind of stay a bit undercover. And I think this is definitely shifting. In this, in the immediate aftermath of Afghanistan, we'll see what kind of refugee issues arise from that. It's not yet clear how many people will even be able to, get out of Afghanistan in order to. But that will be a challenge, and all of, especially the CDU and the Greens, are really positioning Germany to have a more active role in different contexts. And in fact, the Biden administration, is also pushing Germany and Europe in that direction. So I think some degree of that is inevitable.
Yes. Niklas, you've been focusing on a strategic autonomy and whether this Afghanistan, of course, US is a big player in the strategic autonomy discussion in Europe, we know that. So what are your views on?
Yeah, I think the impact on the transatlantic relationship will be very interesting to see. I think one thing is important to note about Germany, that the transatlantic alliance and NATO is really like the core of German strategic culture. So even though there was a lot of press and a lot of opinion pieces now putting out the thesis that will be a major blow also to the transatlantic alliance and to the credibility of NATO, I think the German debate will not evolve around the lines that there would be the idea of weakening the transatlantic link on defense and military issues. Also, like there were some remarks whether this now also puts into questions U.S. security commitments to Baltic countries, to NATO Article 5 commitments. I think this is all a little bit over exaggerated, but I think it will accelerate this discussion on having a stronger European pillar in NATO, as you mentioned already that term. There has been, of course, this discussion has been already going on since decades, but there has been always a very strong focus on capabilities and operational or military burden sharing, right? So spend more money, reach the 2% goal, be better in integrating European defense industries. But what Afghanistan showed is it's not about only the numbers of troops you can put on the ground and the forces you can generate, but it's also about strategy and having the right goals and having the right strategy to implement those goals. So what we might see is that this discussion will say like, okay, yes, we do more military burden sharing, but we also want to have more strategic burden sharing and not just copy paste the plans that the Pentagon develops for Afghanistan and see what we can do around it, but have a more political transatlantic alliance where we really discuss what do we want to achieve in the Sahel zone, what do we want to achieve in Afghanistan. And I think that will be the discussion how to kind of transform the transatlantic alliance, make it more political rather than seeing a weakening of that. And to finish that thought, I think the discussion, Afghanistan comes at a moment where there's already on European level a certain strategic discussion going on. There's the strategic compass discussion within the EU that is heavily actually led by the German Defense Ministry together with the French ones, where crisis management is also a big part of this discussion and what one wants to achieve it. So there are already the debates going on in European circles, and Afghanistan will give a new input and new perspectives on that as well.
Thank you, Niklas. Anna-Lena, do you want to chip in?
Part of the Merkel's legacy is that we are having more European defense. Brexit and Trump's era really shocked Germany and Merkel, and so we have seen a lot of progress in defense politics lately. And Finland, as a non-NATO country, has always a dilemma that what we want and what we can get when thinking about the defense politics inside EU. But right now there's a lot of happening. We shouldn't be so disappointed, actually, in Finland.
Mm. Yes, and I think this leads us nicely to perhaps a final theme, which is EU's common foreign and security policy. Of course, that's broader than security and defense policy, and the defense matters. And I think in the transatlantic context as well, I remember when Biden was administration took over, there were quite a lot of these discussions that the Europeans should think what they can bring into the tables in Washington. That transatlantic relations are not sort of that Europe just comes behind. There needs to be something that Europe can bring to the challenges that America wants to solve in the global scene. And this, of course, then points back to the kind of a European home base and what kind of a foreign policy actor the EU is. And it would be nice to hear your views on how the elections might what kind of impact they might have for the German aspirations when it comes to the common foreign and security policy and its efficiency. There is also the proposal to expand qualified majority voting, a kind of limited fashion though, in that field, and whether that's debated or discussed, or how Germany sees that the common foreign and security policy should be strengthened, or whether it should be strengthened. Maybe I give first to Niklas, then Anna-Lena, and finally Rachel, you get the final word. We have some 3 minutes left.
An interesting part of the German debate on European foreign policy is that it's always very heavily institutional. And you see that when you look at the party platforms now for the elections as well. There's so much space in these party programs on qualified majority voting, on the Spitzenkandidaten project, on process, of choosing the Commission president, different institutional issues when it comes to lists for the European Parliament. But so there is this heavy institutional focus. I don't see. And that is where there's also the processes going on in Europe, but where I don't see really much happening, for example, developments towards qualified majority voting. So even though I think all of the major parties, like the 3 biggest parties in Germany, all support qualified majority voting, I think the resistance on European level is then too strong. And the bigger questions are rather how to how the EU should engage kind of with the US on these issues of great power competition. And but I leave it now to the others to get the final minutes. Sorry.
Anna-Lena.
Finland and Germany, we really much share the same values and ideas and goals in security and foreign politics, and I see that these two countries will be partners. Whoever is the next chancellor, we share the analysis of the challenges like rapidly changing climate, more aggressive Russia, expanding China, global poverty, pandemics, forced migration, cybersecurity issues. So there's a lot to do together. But Finland, the problem in Finland is that our European politics is so reactive. It really is urgent need to more active own security and foreign politics in Europe.
Thank you. And then Rachel.
So, I mean, basically, I agree with what Nicholas said. There's, all of them are sort of aligned in easier voting, streamlining European decision making, and I think, especially with the CDU and the Greens, you do see them signing up to this idea of a stronger European partner in the context of transatlantic policy, and there might be some movement there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's 12 o'clock, so we have to close this panel, and I have to say that it's been highly interesting and enriching. Your opening remarks as well as the discussion has been really bringing in insights to these very important elections and perhaps the aftermath as well, what will happen. And of course, as already was mentioned, the election cycle in Europe goes on. Then we move on to the French EU Council presidency and also the presidential elections, and there is a lot to observe in those elections as well. I wish you a pleasant afternoon and lunchtime. This panel is now over. Thank you.